Today we're revisiting Call of Duty Warzone on Xbox Series X, but more pertinently PlayStation 5, both of which are essentially running enhanced versions of the last-gen game, and now both of them are able to run at up to 120 frames per second. You see, we've been wanting to do a video for a while now on the relative strengths and weaknesses of Back-Compat Plus games on the new wave of consoles, and the arrival of Warzone demonstrates that while there are still set limitations in place, Sony does seem to be enhancing the abilities of last-gen code support, bringing PlayStation 5 closer into line with the feature set of Xbox Series X. 120Hz Warzone was previously an Xbox Series function only, but not anymore. So in this video I'll be talking about Back-Compat Plus viewed through the lens of Warzone. I'll be looking at resolution, performance differentials, and trying to put the Back-Compat capabilities of the machines into focus. And yeah, I'll also be looking at 60Hz too, because fundamentally, on a content level at least, Warzone has changed a lot since we first looked at it running on the new wave of consoles. But first up, I'm pleased to say that this is the first mainline Digital Foundry video mastered at 120 frames per second. Of course, right now, YouTube doesn't support that, and that's a shame. But if you have joined up with the Digital Foundry supporter program and you have a 120Hz screen or capable device, you can download a full frame rate version of this video and see it at full frame rate. And maybe one day when YouTube catches up, this video will actually transcode into a 120 frames per second experience. But for now, before we kick off, a warning, or rather I'd say a piece of advice. Yes, Warzone now runs at 120Hz on PlayStation 5, but there are a couple of issues that require highlighting. First of all, in Activision's patch notes, they say that HDMI 2.1 on your display, that is a requirement. Not so, however. HDMI 2.0 screens and indeed capture cards with 120Hz support work too. But the limitation is that the output is only 1080p, or rather the 4K image downscaled to 1080p. That's why this is a 1080p video, unfortunately. Now, Series X does have 1440p 120 support, which does work on some HDMI 2.0 screens and capture cards as well, but for the sake of parity, this is a 1080p 120 video. So yeah, ignore mentions of HDMI 2.1 in the patch notes. What 2.1 does give you is 4K output at 120Hz in the console, but the game isn't rendering natively at 4K, as we shall discover. The second warning / advice. To get Warzone to run at 120Hz on PS5, you need to disable HDR in the front end. This applies whether you're running on a HDMI 2.0 screen or on an HDMI 2.1 display, and I used an LG CX for my testing. HDR on, you're locked to 60Hz. HDR off, it's 120 frames per second party time. So let's talk comparison methodology. Being a battle royale with a spectate function, we do have a great way of comparing performance and features, and this is how we do it. We have two capture cards in a single PC, running our customized capture tool, connected to PlayStation 5 and Series X simultaneously, acquiring 1080p 120 footage from both of them. We then use cross-play to buddy up as a duo in-game, then get capturing. Okay, first order of business is to get gunned down as quickly as possible and then to lose in the gulag. What happens then is that both consoles will shift into spectator mode, usually spectating the same player. And yeah, that's it. That's how we can get entirely like-for-like footage from both consoles. For our testing here, both PS5 and Series X have all 4 of the high-resolution texture packs installed, and graphical features. They're set to be exactly the same on both. So we'll talk about resolution shortly, but the graphics are indeed essentially the same, which is in common with our findings both on the last comparison we did on PS5 and Series X, but also with PS4 Pro and One X back in the day. Resolution, we'll talk about that in a bit. Now, that's not to say that there aren't some variances though in the graphical makeup, but this does seem to come down to dynamic elements. So for example, the ring of green volumetric gas surrounding the play area. That is generated differently for every player, and so it can be thicker and more difficult to see through for one player compared to what another player might be seeing. But this is nothing to do with console specs or anything like that, simply a dynamic element. From my spectating, I note that there are players who stick to the very edge of the play area and sometimes move into the gas temporarily, especially in the end game. In these scenarios, I'm fairly confident in saying that visibility is not like for like, but it's entirely random as to who might have an advantage. Level of detail, LOD, also seems to be somewhat dynamic, which brings us on to how Back-Compat Changes work between PlayStation 5 and Series X. So we know from Microsoft that their SDK allows developers to query the hardware, so they know what system the code is running on, and they can open up features accordingly. And we never quite knew how it was done on PlayStation, but yeah, basically it's the same. Based on developer documentation I've seen, the SCE kernel is Prospero system call returns 1 if the game is running on PlayStation 5, or 0 if it's not. From there, developers can do whatever they really want. So typically, why don't we see much customization on the PS5 front? Why not? Higher resolutions, for example. Well, the same documentation says that while you do get extra horsepower from CPU and GPU, you don't get any extra RAM. So what does that have to do with Warzone? Well, in theory, quite a lot. In practice, not so much. Series X can address at least the same amount of memory as Xbox One X, meaning 9 gigs of RAM up against 5.5 on PS4 Pro and thus PS5. When I visited Infinity Ward, they expected their streaming system to take advantage of One X's extra RAM, but in actuality we didn't really see much gain in the final title. PS5 versus Series X, it's much the same. Level of detail can favour one system or another, but on balance I actually found that model geometry and textures in the mid-distance often seem to resolve to a higher level of detail on Xbox Series X, more often than they did on PS5. This isn't any meaningful change to visual quality overall, and certainly not in any way that makes gameplay any different. Warzone is scrupulously coded for fairness, even when stacked up against PC running on low spec. But any difference at all is curious nonetheless, I guess. Resolution though, that is a different matter, and here, per our last testing, Xbox Series X has a noticeable advantage. It renders at a minimum of 1920 by 2160, reconstructing up to full 4K very rarely. The presentation, I'd say, looks very clean overall, thanks to that reconstruction. I can't really show you the full resolution in motion, owing to the fact that no HDMI 2.1 capture solutions exist. But what I can do is take a system level screenshot to show you the clarity. Looks pretty clean in my opinion. And here's the same scene on PlayStation 5. This renders in a dynamic resolution window that seems to be in the region of 1512p to 1566p. Regardless, it's visibly blurrier. There's no doubt in my mind that Xbox gets more out of that HDMI 2.1 4K 120 connection, even if it's not actual 4K. The tables turn when we look at performance, where undoubtedly PlayStation 5 has a commanding advantage. Both versions of the game can drop frames, dramatically so in the sequence before the initial drop, but actual gameplay is pretty one-sided here. For the vast majority of the experience, PS5 is mostly locked to 120 FPS with full VSync. So in common with quite a few Back-Compat Plus titles, you're getting the same resolution as the PS4 Pro game, but it is matched with a 2x performance multiplier. There can be small dips beneath, but it works for me as a really good 120Hz experience. Clearly there are issues on Xbox Series X. It's rare that the game locks to 120 frames per second, and typically performance lingers in the 90 to 110 FPS range. Now it is important to point out that the difference between 30 and 60 and 90 to 120 FPS may well be the same 30 FPS, but the experience is very different. 30 to 60, a 16.7 millisecond frame time differential. 90 to 120, this reduces to just 2.8 milliseconds. I'll explain why that's important in a bit, but here's the thing. It's not so much the frame rate that is the issue with Series X, more the stuttering and judder, which you can really feel in motion. I'm slowing down the footage here so you can see on the PS5 side we're getting consistent even frame delivery. On the Xbox Series X side there's stutter and even some screen tearing. It's not really ideal, but Xbox's secret weapon, if you can call it that, variable refresh rate support. If this is running and it works on your display, the judder is gone. You retain the extra clarity of the improved resolution, and essentially the game is an absolute treat. Assuming a 90 to 110 frames per second window, that's basically a 9 to 11 millisecond frame time range versus 8.3 on PlayStation 5. Now I'm sure hardened Warzone players can tell the difference. Personally, I can't. So if I had to choose, I'd play Series X with VRR, as visually it looks better and still delivers big response time improvements over 60 Hz and extra fluidity. But if VRR isn't an option for your screen and high frame rate is a must, PS5 doesn't judder to anything like the same degree as Series X and therefore is overall the better option in gameplay terms. From my perspective, if you're on Series X and VRR isn't an option, well, to be honest, I'd stick with 60 Hz. And it's here where the Back-Compat tech legacy shows a stark divide. Warzone may well have a 120 Hz performance advantage on PlayStation 5, but resolution is effectively unchanged at 60 Hz, with the same kind of 1512p to 1566p DRS range, which is pretty much the same as what we saw in 120 Hz mode. Performance is locked at 60 frames per second though, as you would expect. Series X though is seemingly native 4K, and the resolution differential delivers a significantly cleaner image, plus the same performance level as PS5. Now it's highly likely that the horizontal scaler could kick in the heaviest scenes, but by and large it's a really nice crisp look. Why there is a clarity differential between PS5 and Series X in 60 Hz mode? Well, I can't say for sure, but the likelihood is that the constrained memory in PS4 Pro is still an issue in Back-Compat mode on PS5. The horsepower is there to do 4K, no doubt about it, but the technical legacy of the Pro may suggest that the memory isn't. RAM allocation was never a problem for Xbox One X, it had a lot more of it, therefore it isn't for Series X either. But on the flip side, looking at those last-gen consoles, the Pro always ran smoother than One X. This seems to translate into the 120 Hz mode on the next-gen systems, but even more so. And yeah, just a reminder here that the PS5 has a higher GPU multiplier versus PS4 Pro than Series X has versus One X, so it kind of stands to reason. The addition of 120 Hz support to a PS4 game running on PS5 does suggest that things are changing on the Sony side though, but the extent to which we may see further changes remains unknown. And in the case of Warzone, we've already had the announcement that PS5 and Series consoles will be getting the full native application experience. They'll have access to all the memory, the enhanced features of the various implementations of RDNA 2, along with its IPC boosts, and of course all the advantages of those new advanced storage APIs. The further we get into the generation proper, the less we'll see these legacy last-gen apps being deployed on a new wave of consoles. But that's where we're at on this one. If you're PS5 only, Warzone's 120 Hz update gives you twice the frame rate with no real downsides compared to the existing 60 Hz experience. Just remember to turn off HDR to get it working properly. If somehow you have the ability to choose between PS5 and Series X, I'd personally go for Series X if you're limited to a 60 Hz screen, Series X at 120 if you have VRR, but PS5 at 120 if no VRR is available. But yeah, that's pretty much where we're going to leave things for now. So yeah, like, subscribe, share, ring the bell for the wondrous bounty that is instant notifications when new content drops, and do consider the DF supporter program. Interact with the team and the DF community, get access to a big bunch of bonus extras, and of course pristine quality video downloads, including this very video, available as a full 120 frames per second experience. But yeah, that's Warzone as it runs now on Series X and PS5. Hope you enjoyed the video, and thanks for making it to the end of this one if indeed you did. And just generally, thanks for watching and supporting Digital Foundry.